Hi, folks. Let's talk it over. And Ween today, of course, my wonderful co-host, Monica Brinkman, and our returning guest, Debbie Ann Close. And for those of you who don't remember or didn't catch the previous one, Debbie has a unique situation in that she has what people call usually multiple personalities, alters, headmates, I think was
That's a nice springly one, isn't it?
That's the present term, yes.
I love that one. And we were talking about when this came up, and again, to just summarize, it obviously reflects early childhood experience, trauma, etc., as it always does with that particular kind of issue. For Debbie, it came to the fore when her 4-year-old child, a little girl, and her headmate, her alter within her, who was also 4 years old, started sharing secrets. And obviously they're Debbie's secrets. And these were secrets that were upsetting, horrifying, etc. And when Debbie and her then husband Carl became aware of these issues, they took the little girl, as they certainly should have, to a therapist, who then things kind of get a little bit more problematic, because instead of dealing with it as a family thing and trying to figure out what was going on, Debbie ended up being diagnosed. And as soon as you label somebody, to me, that's the beginning of problems. And then Debbie went to a therapist, and the therapist was a strongly Christian therapist. And then Debbie met somebody, and a friend, and she's desperate to have friends. She had not ever really trusted friendship, and understandably so. Most people who suffer from this kind of traumatic childhood problem don't trust friends. They don't trust well. And so with the therapist's encouragement, Debbie, you got involved with this friend whom we're calling Jane.
Right.
Okay, and now let's pick that story up. The therapist now goes to work in a church instead of being in an agency. And Jane expresses that she wants to be a therapist or help people. And okay, pick up from there if you would.
Yeah. So I had a choice to either go with the therapist to her, start working with her in her church office, or stay at the clinic and go on with another therapist. But I already been with this therapist. With the therapist, we're going to call her Renegade just for that.
I like that name.
Okay. So, and the story will show why we decided to call her Renegade. So Renegade was going to leave the clinic and start working in her church office and doing services there as a therapist. Her and her husband were building a church. And I had a choice to go with her and start seeing her at her church office, or stay at the clinic and get a new therapist. Well, I'd already been with her for about 2 years and we were doing a lot of work with several altars at that point. So I just started seeing her at her church office. And so anyways, one of the problems I was having a lot of marital problems, also having a lot of my own problems, a lot of personal problems, a lot of problems trusting, feeling secure and confident, a lot of problems developing friendships, which had been my whole life. So I met Jane at a fasting seminar, and at that time in my life practiced a lot of water fasting, and So I went to one of this young lady's teachings on water fasting because I had an interest in that. And I went up to talk to her after the lecture, and we just got along, and we both had 3 kids. And so we started playing tennis together, and we did a couple of hikes together, and we're developing a friendship. But I was having my issues come up, and that have something to do with another horrific memory that was making me want to always be included and be part of something, but also at the same time not trust it was going to betray me. It was going to cause a nightmare. So I was having those problems. So I took those problems to Renee, and she was encouraging me to work through those. That this Jane lady was a really nice lady, and they actually wanted to meet her. And because Jane wanted to also take classes and go to school to be a psychiatrist or a psychologist. So Jane met Renegade, and they developed some type of a layman. Maybe Jane started going to her church. I don't know. But anyways, Renegade wanted me to let Jane know that I had DID, and start allowing her to help me in between appointments, which most therapists do need another person to help them, because it's not a 1 hour a job week. And so so I was concerned to do that, but I talked to Carl about it, and we talked, and we were kind of reserved because I've never told anyone about these things in my life. And but we finally did. We told her, and she was very interested, very aware, or very interested, and wanted more information. And so we were developing friendship, but we were also developing what seemed like a layman therapy type of friendship as our working relationship in between my appointments with Renegade. And when we got together as a friend, talking about what we were struggling with and what we wanted, because we would pray and we would fast together, and I would let her know that I would have my heart was aching because I felt. And so I went to one of this young lady's teachings on water fasting because I had an interest in that, and I went up to talk to her after the lecture, and we just got along, and we both had 3 kids. And so we started playing tennis together, and we did a couple of hikes together, and we're developing a friendship. But I was having my issues come up, and that have something to do with another horrific memory that was making me want to always be included and be part of something, but also at the same time not trust it was going to betray me. It was going to cause a nightmare. So I was having those problems. So I took those problems to Renee, and she was encouraging me to work through those. That this Jane lady was a really nice lady, and they actually wanted to meet her. And because Jane wanted to also take classes and go to school to be a psychiatrist or a psychologist. So Jane met Renegade, and they developed some type of a layman. Maybe Jane started going to her church. I don't know. But anyways, Renegade wanted me to let Jane know that I had DID, and start allowing her to help me in between appointments, which most therapists do need another person to help them, because it's not a 1 hour a job week. And so so I was concerned to do that, but I talked to Carl about it, and we talked, and we were kind of reserved because I've never told anyone about these things in my life. And but we finally did. We told her, and she was very interested, very aware, or very interested, and wanted more information. And so we were developing friendship, but we were also developing what seemed like a layman therapy type of friendship as our working relationship in between my appointments with Renegade. And when we got together as a friend, talking about what we were struggling with and what we wanted, because we would pray and we would fast together, and I would let her know that I would have my heart was.
I did have a question. How much of all of this background did Carl know at this point? All these memories and things that you were sharing with the therapist and the altars. Was he privy to?
Carl?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. The therapist actually brought him in, which I today don't think is a good idea. But I mean, yes, he was always in the know, and he lived with me, so he was seeing a lot of stuff. But she, at one point, with the younger altar Light, she would have Light sit on his lap, and then she would have her tell him, what her fears were. And then
Debbie, would you be comfortable if we just left this at this point and came back on another day?
That's fine.
I did have a question. How much of all of this background did Carl know at this point? all these memories and things that you were sharing with the therapist and the altars. Was he privy to?
Carl?
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah. The therapist actually brought him in, which I today don't think is a good idea. But I mean, yes, he was always in the know, and he lived with me, so he was seeing a lot of stuff. But she at one point with the younger altar Light, she would have Light sit on his lap, and then she would have her tell him, you know, what her fears were, and then they would have Carl come in on some sessions and have him like meet the altars, and even though he's already seen them, but like meet them and kind of fill him in on what's going on. And at one of the sessions, she had my little altar sit on his lap, and at the time, you know, we're just being instructed and guided by therapists what to do. Looking back now, I just don't think that was a good idea, because I think it mixed up roles. His role, my role, the altar's roles. Carl became to me at times God, at times darkness, at times an uncle, an aunt, a grandfather, a grandmother, a father, a mother, you know, and he's trying to be a husband and I'm trying to be a wife. And we're all having way too many roles.
Absolutely.
Bottom him and too confusing for the system. And so,
and also must have been very confusing for the kids.
Our biological kids.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure. Gosh, yeah. I'm sure. Yeah. So when Jane learned about what my heartache was and what it was my prayer and my concern at that time, and that's how to be a better wife, my sexuality was zilch, and I knew that was part of being married, even though Carl was always very gracious and kind, never forced me, but yet it was something I wanted to do and be able to enjoy that aspect of marriage. And it just was horrific for me. And so during our time as a friendship, we would share with each other what we wanted to pray about, what we were fasting about. And my fasting times are always about being the mother that I imagined myself being, because I was totally opposite of what I was imagining myself being, and to be a more functional, grounded, loving wife. And so, and then she asked me, you know, what's keeping you from these things? I said, well, at that time she knew about the multiplicity. And I said, well, I don't know. We're just talking. So I just said, I don't know. I do have an altar who has homosexual tendencies. And she became very interested and wanted to hear a lot more about that particular altar. She was very interested in the condition, but when that particular discussion came up, that's really what she wanted to hear about every time we got together, was this altar who was gay. But my words were homosexual tendencies, and which is true. For many years of my life, there was an altar who was very comfortable around women, but not so much sexually comfortable. But yet, because of her comfort, I would think of her as maybe gay or homosexual tendencies. We don't know what it was. This was back in the 80s, so 70s, 80s, and now 1990. So anyways, so Jane began to want to talk to this altar, and they started developing a friendship. And at that time, things started getting weird for me. So now I have to talk to you as first person. It's like I have to talk to you just to help keep the story straight. So at the time of myself trying to operate the body, being the daily operation system, being a mother, being a wife, being a Christian, going through therapy and so forth, I am starting to feel awkward that Jennifer is spending so much time with this altar who has homosexual tendencies, because of the things that Jane was now starting to express, and began poetry and flowers, and always wanting to come over and pray together. But then she'd always want to talk to this particular altar. And so I started to get curious and be concerned. Plus, I still had my insecurity.
I want to stop you here at this point. I mean, clearly Jane is coming on to your altar, and are you sharing that with Renegade? With the
Absolutely. Absolutely. I told Renegade several times. I even told Carl. Carl didn't like Jane and was also very uncomfortable with some of Jane's. She was always over. She was just coming over all the time and, very active in our life. It was too much.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but Carl had, per Renegade, he had his insecurities, codependencies, all this kind of jealousies. I had my stuff. And Renegade kept saying it was our issues, that Jane was a godsend, that she was a good, amazing woman and she would never do anything like that. And that we can trust her and trust God because God is bringing good things into our life.
So let's go back to that word, folks, in case you forgot it from the last session. Iatrogenic, caused by the doctor. This thought, I hate to say it, but it seems to me that a lot of this is now getting made worse and intensified. And how did you get out of this? I mean, obviously at some point, Jane went away.
So probably it took about a year before her and my altar became intimate, because I kept going kind of back and forth. I kept going what people, and I like that you don't like diagnosis, because I would be looked at as borderline, attachment issues, and really it's not. It's just I was having PTSD from an early childhood memory, plus I was picking up on Jane's.
I'm going to teach you a new word, one that's been used a lot wrongly. Okay, the first word is transference, and that means that you relate to somebody else as if they were somebody different, somebody from your past, somebody significant in your life. Like, you go to school and you find a teacher and you treat the teacher as if they were a parent. That's transference. And in therapy, very often it happens, especially in psychoanalytic therapy, where the therapist, you project certain qualities onto the therapist because, it's like you're just like my father. You're just like my mother. Then there's another word, countertransference. And most people don't know what that is. That's the response that you have to somebody's transference. So if they're treating you like mommy and you start acting like mommy, that's your countertransference. Mm-hmm. So like for a therapist, it means like, you're just like my father. Well, I've been I'm just like Papa. Okay, and we can all get caught up in that kind of transference and countertransference throughout our lives.
Right.
Okay. Once the dance has begun and it gets distorted, especially the more strongly it's distorted by early trauma, the harder it is for us to perceive it and understand it. And what you're describing is a transference, countertransference kind of dance that went on. And my guess is, now without knowing anything about the altar that you're talking about, I'm going to guess that she was adolescent age, early adolescent, and that she needed to, again, connect to this outside world, to be part of the teen world, and to be close to her girlfriends.
You know what? For you not knowing the story, you know it pretty well and I didn't know that later until I met Dr. Payman years later in 2017 when all this started to come out, because I went through dark nights of the soul. But anyways, that altar, when asked why did she allow Jane to kiss her, at first she didn't, but then she did. And one of it was that she felt like she became very robotic when her friend, inner world friend, Debbie, got married. But but the altar, we'll call her Deb, she loved Debbie very much. They were very close, joined at the hip since very young. They grew up together as altars. And so she was happy for Debbie. So when Jane went to kiss her, after Jane promised everyone, me, that she would never do something like that, even if she was asked point blank, would you ever kiss this altar? Absolutely not. No way. Well, she did.
Of course.
Did kiss her. And when my altar agreed to kiss her back, and the question was, why did you do that? And it was exactly what Ken just said. She had gone through, at this point, 7-8 years of the marriage of just becoming robotic. She lost her life. She became almost a nobody again, which was very triggering for her because she carried the name Nobody when she was a little girl. Aww. And all of a sudden, this person, Jane, who's smart and who's had nothing to do with sexuality, but just someone who gave her attention, someone who was sending her poetry and sending her flowers and talking about how great she was and just wanted to listen to her talk. And no one ever would listen to this Deb talk. And so, yes, so that's part of her truth. The other part of the truth is she felt like she had no choice because she was afraid that Jane would no longer like Debbie as a friend, and Debbie's dreams are coming true per Renee, that she was finally getting friendship. She's trying to trust God. And so, and then the other part, which we didn't find this out until just 2 years ago, that Deb, this altar, was also carrying trauma, and she did not know it. She always saw herself as someone who protected. She was very close to other altars, and she was like the overseer. And so, but she realized, talking to Dr. Payman all these years later, that she was actually holding the message of, you never say no. When you say no, there's severe punishment. And so all of those things are happening at the same time for her. And
she managed to connect with somebody who was so needy and demanding. Because one of the things that we have to understand here is that Jane clearly has her own pathology, to use a word, her own shtick, and her transference is playing a big part of this. Okay, her distortion.
Right. And then one more thing that was also on the plate at that time, which I can't believe we survived all this, was also Renegade, the therapist, was always trying to find out who the host was. Who's the host? Who's the host? Who's the host? It was a big thing back then. And so Debbie always thought she was, but Debbie could never get her life together as a mother and a wife. And everything she tried to talk about serious water fasting and prayers and claiming this and this and this and going to therapy, doing the work. Nothing was making any better in this girl's life. Her altars were starting to make some headway, but nothing was getting better in her life. It was getting worse and worse and worse. So they came to a point when she started thinking that she was actually an altar, not the host. And then with Jane in the picture, and Jane and Deb getting along so well, and our biological kids feeling like our home has got some life in it, some normalcy in it with the appearance of it, we started thinking that Deb was the host, and thinking that Deb had homosexual tendencies. This was on past after the kiss, thinking that maybe that's the way we need to go. The marriage was failing way before we met Jane and Renegade. And so, and Jane and Renegade didn't cause the failure of the marriage. Debbie and Carl caused the failure of the marriage. But the way all this happened with Renegade and Jane brought a horrible, and the way they did not take ownership for their parts caused more severe trauma. And I would love Ken to interject that word, because I want to learn that word, because that word that you were saying earlier is powerful and describes that to a T.
Well, usually when you meet people who have dissociative states, iatrogenic issues are very common. Okay, and they're common because the therapist starts playing, God, puppeteer. And in reality, of course, I mean, we can talk about a host or an ego, but the reality is that the goal should be for a whole integrated person
Yeah.
that shares all of the memories, all of the feelings, and understands that life is messy. Understands that there are parts that we don't want to deal with, that were painful, and understands that we have to be open to sharing those and being part of them. Now, you said something, and I wanted to go back to it because it's very important to me. You said that the marriage was failing and that was Carl and Deb's fault or some responsibility. And obviously, to some degree, that's true. But let me ask you something, because I know, folks, I've talked to Deb before. You and Carl are still friends.
We are very good friends, and which really shows our true character and our integrity.
You are.
And we both were tricked into believing something, and we're convinced to believe something. We're forced to believe something that just wasn't believable. And that is that Jane had no ulterior motives, that she really just wanted to be a friend. And even after the first kiss, Deb still thought, because she apologized, said, you know what, I'm so sorry. So Deb was still trying to give her grace, thinking that we could still, because Jane would continue to say that Debbie and I can be friends and very close and still be within the eyes of God. And she would kiss the cheek or kiss the forehead. And one time I asked her, would you ever, because you're getting so close to Deb, and because of her homosexual tendencies, and you're very interested in homosexuality, it seems like, you're asking a lot of questions. I'm just getting awkward and uncomfortable. And I go, would you ever kiss her? I would never kiss her on the mouth, ever. I would always kiss her on the cheek. Well, she did kiss her on the mouth. And so, but there was something I wanted to say. It was really important I say this. And that is, so Debbie tried so hard to deal with what was oppressing her and causing her a mental, I don't know the word to use for this, but a mental fuck, because her gut was telling her something's not right here with Jane and her Walter, and yet she was also being haunted by the memory that she was not conscious of, but was affecting her emotional flashbacks, a lot of emotional flashbacks about being a friend and being a part of something and being liked, to, oh no, the most horrific betrayal that this body's ever experienced, even worse than the 1964 Halloween memory with the four-year-old.
Right.
So that energy has been following me. So she was battling all of that at the same time. And so she was still, and no one was believing her. Well, I'm sorry, Renegade wasn't believing her. It's not Jane. Jane's not the problem here. You can trust this. You can trust this. So in essence, this was not a conscious plan, but in essence, Debbie had to prove that she wasn't trustworthy and that she didn't set out to do that. But hanging out with Jane more eventually turned into a sexual experience.
But then, of course, you see, now we're getting into this. Okay, why did you need to prove to Renegade?
Because she wasn't believing me.
But why did you need to prove to her?
Because I wasn't believing myself.
No, I think you were believing yourself.
I wasn't trusting. I was still trying to believe that Renegade and Jane were absolutely right, and that we could just have a friendship.
Well, why did you need that? No, I'm asking you a question about how you were perceiving the world in which you were living, because it's very important, and if I have any therapists listening to me, this is very, very important. You become God, you become daddy, you become mommy, you become the teacher, and the client doesn't feel that they have the ability, the strength to say, hey, God, you're wrong. Now I have to share an experience out of my own analysis, and I had a very good analyst, and thankfully, and it was a traditional analysis, lying on the couch 3 times a week kind of thing, and the dreams, the whole smear. Anyway, there was a point in my life where I had almost killed my father. I was a teenager, and he pushed and pushed and pushed till I reached that. And Aaron, my analyst, who was a very good guy, his father had died when he was a kid. And so he had just really could not cope with the idea that a father could push you to that. And so, he said, well, Ken, are you sure you're not making this up? I guess this sounds like what they call a screen memory. And, I was very fortunate because I was strong enough and knowledgeable enough to say, well, I tell you what, I'm going to check with reality here. So I called somebody, one of my father's friends who had been there at that moment. And I said, Max, I want to check something with you. And he said, what? I said, something from my childhood. He said, oh, you mean the time you nearly killed your father with the axe? I said, thank you, Max. So I went back to the next session and I said, Aaron, I called this guy, explained who he was. I said, and this is what his response was. And Aaron was at least strong enough as a therapist to say, well, I stand corrected. But most of the time, therapists don't like being corrected. And we have to be very careful of that, folks, because your truth is not necessarily true truth. And of course, the worst example of that in history is Freud, who, when he could no longer deal with the fact that his clients, so many of them had been sexually abused, particularly by family members, he decided that it was all in their heads, and he called it a complex. and that allowed him to continue his practice and allowed him to continue. But all of those people, especially the women, were then forced into becoming once again victimized. And we have to be very careful of that because we can victimize our clients and we don't mean to.
No. And I know that Renegade certainly didn't mean to. And I just want to make sure, though, I just want to speak clearly that I wasn't testing Jane. I was really I was praying my heart was in prayer all the time. Please let this be good. Please let this be something I can trust. Mm-hmm. And let time show that she is truly just my dearest, closest friend who can be very close, but still be very much, in our words at that time, the eyes of God. Those are not the words I use today, but that's what I used then. And so I was hoping and believing and trusting that my gut was wrong. At that time, we're talking 30 years ago, I could not trust my gut for nothing. And even to this day, I have a very difficult time trusting my gut. And that comes way before Renegade and Jane.
Yes, that is the essence, actually, in many ways of dissociative disorder, is not trusting your gut. And we're going to have to stop here for this session. We're going to keep talking with Debbie Close because I think, Debbie, you're an incredibly brave person. I think as you tell your story, I'm hoping someday you'll not just tell it to us, but that you'll also perhaps write it down and make, do something with it. So both therapists and people who are wondering about their own lives and particularly people who are suffering from this kind of fragmentation can learn from it. And Monica, I don't know about you, Monica, but I think that in this life, people who end up hopefully getting what karma, I guess you could call it, as the wheel turns, if you will. And so I'd like you today, after this show, put up one of your book trailers, because that's something you write about a lot.
Okay. Debbie, so much again for joining us and sharing parts of your life with us. I'm hoping that people will be open enough to get a better understanding and not be judgmental. And I know that you're going to come back and we'll talk more. But for now, folks, we're going to say goodbye to Deb. And here you go. Enjoy.
Thank you.